I love any opportunity to talk about this and try to inform the community and lots of different communities about what's going on. So just to give you a bit of background about myself, I'm an environmental engineer by background. I've worked in the construction and waste industry for about 25 years. And initially I was pretty agnostic about waste incineration. I thought it was a very valid part of the waste hierarchy. I had previously visited the Edmonton Incinerator to conduct an audit, and yeah, everything was fine. It seemed like a good solution to two problems, how to dispose of a load of waste that nobody wanted and to generate useful energy from it. That was my training in engineering, and everything seemed fine. Then I became involved with the Stop the Edmonton Incinerator campaign through a bit of a long journey. And at first, I just thought it was a sort of NIMBY campaign, from ill-informed protesters. But I kept an open mind and I did my research and started to question the received wisdom of my training, and very quickly started to see the holes in the whole waste to energy model, and started looking at more modern research and new scientific evidence about the harms of incineration, and particularly things about how incineration is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more that you build, the more waste needs to be generated to feed into the incinerators to keep it burning. And in fact, DEFRA statistics in the UK show us that where incineration capacity increases, recycling rates correspondingly decrease. And that's to do with the economics of waste and the fact that a waste incinerator contract is set up with a local authority for 25 years. The waste is relatively cheap to dispose of, and they're locked into waste quantities over a period of time. Conversely, a recycling contract with a local authority is only 2 or 3 years. Waste prices fluctuate, and it is a commodities-based market, and so it's more risky, potentially more expensive. And because of the model of contracts, it means that the investment in recycling infrastructure is low. So a financial proposition to an investor for a fixed 25-year contract is far more attractive than a fluctuating 2-year contract where the investment is risky. And so when you look at incineration in that sort of economic backdrop, you understand why incinerators get built and why recycling is year upon year upon year, decade upon decade underinvested in, and the kind of poor cousin of waste management. So I sort of started to understand these things, also the science around fluid dynamics, the way that particulates behave, the fact that filters, even the most modern filters, which we hear about at Edmonton, do not capture the finest particles. And those ultrafine particles are the ones which are the most harmful to human health. They are produced in high numbers. They are not captured by filters because they behave as a gas, not as a solid particle like the larger particles. And so they bypass even the most sophisticated filter technology. Now, this is stuff that I understand from my engineering background. And when I listen to pathologists talking about this particulate science, it really, it really strikes me that this is something that our councillors are not learning, they're not understanding, they're not reading the latest air pollution science, which really has started to gather pace as a result of COVID. And so all of these things we're learning are very new science, but compelling nonetheless, and linked very much to the sorts of health inequalities that we've been learning about, that linked to Delia's point on social justice. There's also a number of other points that are really important to make. One is that in 2015, when the environmental studies were conducted in advance of the authorities receiving development consent, the models and the projections for waste volumes and quantities were just predictions, they were estimates for the future. Over the last few years since development consent was received, we have seen a divergence between the projected waste quantities and actual waste quantities. They projected significantly more waste than we're currently producing. And they also did not factor in the new Environment Act and the Resources and Waste Strategy, which has been now published by the government. That will result in even further reducing waste quantities. And so what we know is that the waste projections by the NLWA are significantly higher than what we now predict. When confronted with this information, what they say is, oh, well, that's okay. We'll just dial down the incinerator. We'll just burn less. Now, that is just ridiculous for them to say it. Number one, because they're investing our money in this capital equipment. So the cost of building it, the cost of buying it, the cost of running and maintaining it is proportionate to its initial sizing. And so they are building something far too large for our needs. And all they're saying is that they will reduce it. The second point is that when you borrow money to build something, you have to create a financial business case for the decades following that demonstrates the amount of waste that's going in. And obviously, well, the way that a business case works for an incinerator is that every truck that comes in pays a gate fee. If you're taking less waste, then you're getting less money through the door. You know, and you cannot then pay back the loan that you've taken from government and from the banks to pay back on the basis of the waste that you're taking, which is reduced. And so the financial model does not stack up if they're taking less. They're also now linking a heat network to this incinerator, and they have not satisfactorily answered the question about whether the Meridian Water housing development, which is supposed to be served by the heat network, whether that heat network will function if the amount of waste going into the incinerator is significantly less than projected. And so we are potentially locking in the residents of Meridian Water into a heat network that doesn't work. Now, what we suspect is going to happen is that we will get to a point where Meridian Water is linked to a heat network, and then NLWA will simply say, well, we can't produce the heat that's required without buying in additional waste from further afield. And so we think this is what's going to happen, because the incinerator, why would you build it so large if you're not going to use the capacity? And we just think this is storing up problems for the future, where the NLWA start accepting waste from further and further afield in order to make the financial case stack up. And really, this is locking in Edmonton as being the dumping ground of the UK. Because once that capacity is built, it then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that it has to continue to be used at its maximum capacity. Further, I've just got a couple more points to make. The landscape has changed significantly since 2015. We had reports in the paper last week that the UK emissions trading scheme, which is the tax in the UK for industrial carbon emissions, there are reports now from Westminster that ministers favour bringing waste incineration into this carbon pricing scheme as of next year. Now, we don't know that for certain, but it is a high likelihood that that will happen, which will add £25 million a year estimate, and that will be an increasing figure every year, onto the financial liability of this incinerator, which so far hasn't been priced. Another reason why we think our council should stop and review whether or not the economic case stacks up here. And then finally, carbon capture and storage. So this incinerator, the Committee on Climate Change, has recommended that all incinerators either remain unbuilt or have carbon capture and storage technology added to them. Our incinerator here in Edmonton has not priced for that. And they have now written to people who have inquired saying, basically, don't worry, the government will pay for it. So when they require us to put it on, we will go back to the government and say, if you want us to put it on, then you have to pay us for it. again, this is taxpayers' money. You know, it's not just money that comes from nowhere. This incinerator doesn't need to be built at all. We've been told by the Mayor's office that once this incinerator is built, London will have almost 1 million tonnes a year over capacity of incineration in London. This incinerator is 700,000 tonnes. It could remain entirely unbuilt and we would still have excess capacity in London. And imagine what we could do with that land. We could turn it into a proper recycling centre, a full recycling processing centre that's fit for the future. We could return it to parkland. We could give the people of Edmonton, you know, some lungs again in, you know, turning that site into green space. There's all sorts of things we could do with that space and that money. And so we just say that this is, not only is it unjust, but financially it doesn't stack up, technologically it doesn't stack up. It's a bad idea. And I will end there. Thank you.